So, what's a Legionaries? This is going to be an unedited solo transmission. It's been quite a while since I've done one of these, but I had a last minute invitation, let's say, to travel somewhere, and I brought along some of my equipment. And because I don't have a podcast scheduled, I figured I would speak to you one on one, as it has been quite some time since I've done a conversation this way, straight from me, your honored legate of New Rome, to you, the legionary. And the topic I wanted to discuss today was surrounding artificial intelligence, consciousness, and the eventual singularity. And I wanted to talk about some of my insights into Jean Baudrillard, Martin Heidegger, a little bit of Hegel actually in the mix, George Bataille, and of course there's always Nietzsche to bring it all together. Now, at the beginning of my third episode of Aerotechnica, I brought up a quote by Nietzsche from his essay on truth and untruth, or on truth and lies, written in 1873. And in one part of the essay, Friedrich Nietzsche brought up what makes man different from beasts, what separates men from animals. And I read the quote on Aerotechnica episode 3, so if you want to see that quote, just go watch the beginning of that episode. But to sort of summate it, what he was saying is that humans have the unique ability to view an object beyond its functionality. So the sort of function that biological life is driven towards is life itself, survival. And that base impulse sees different objects in relation to that organism's ability to survive. So the function of, let's say, water is sustenance, food, sustenance, shelter to keep you safe from the elements. Animals can't really view life so much beyond the mere functionality of objects. Now, as I stated in Aerotechnica, there are some exceptions. And I brought up the example of the penguin who brings little pebbles as an offering, much as the way that we do with diamonds, for instance. The little penguin offers up a rock, and this rock is supposed to represent some sort of mating ritual. And ideally, the penguin, the female penguin, accepts this token of his desire to mate. And though the rock itself doesn't really have much of a function to these penguins, now it might be related to their nesting, because they bring these rocks together and they create little nests with the rocks. So maybe that could be it. But there's not really anything functional in that simple rock, and yet it symbolically represents this mating ritual, which eventually evolves in humans to represent what we consider to be love. But by and large, animals don't have the function of attaching symbolic value to objects. They merely look at it for its use value to fulfill the function of survival. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because we have to look at artificial intelligence in a similar way. Intelligence is something different than consciousness. There are things that are much more intelligent than you and I. If we consider an LLM that essentially has the internet as a data set, it can know things, quote unquote, know things, so much beyond what we can. It has what is essentially a perfect memory. It has the ability to, at not even the snap of a finger, get all this information, collect all this information, sift through all this information, and create a product out of it. You ask it a question, it can answer it. That's a higher intelligence than we possess. What they don't possess is the ability to use that intelligence to any actual intentional ends. They cannot create ends or goals for themselves. They are programmed to fulfill a function by the person programming these LLMs, these artificial intelligences. So while they are more intelligent than us, and I'm defining intelligence here as more or less the ability to complete a task, let's say. So the intelligence of an animal is to fulfill the task survive. Consciousnness relates more to emotions and feelings. And of course, we have to qualify this, because if we just say emotions and feelings, we start to get sappy and cliche. It's as if we're just sort of saying words. So what are emotions in this context in relation to consciousness? And I think we have to view emotions feeling as the ability to take the objective world around us and see it beyond functionality, and then intentionally act upon that awareness we have in the world. Humans can do things that serve no purpose. They can do things that are actually detrimental to the base function of survival. And this is very interesting because it means that we do have a degree of free will. Now, as many have noted, we don't have total free will. For example, I am born a human man. That means I am not a human woman. That also means I am not a velociraptor. I am not a bald eagle. I can't fly. Now, that does not mean I am not free, because I can choose to direct my energy towards a different mode of flying. I may not be able to fly the way an eagle can. I have no wings. I cannot naturally fly. What I can do, because Prometheus gave me the gift of techne, I can go and get all these different things in the natural world, move them together, construct them together, figure out the technique that is going to lead to combustion first, and then beyond that, from combustion, what is going to lead to aerodynamics, to be able to create engines that propel a flying object across the sky. And all of a sudden, because of that gift from Prometheus, that Promethean fire, I can fly. Now, my free will is limited by the fact that I myself, as a human, cannot get up and fly. But I can create things. I can reorder the predetermined significations of my life, that being that I cannot fly on my own. That's a predetermined signification of what it means to be human. I may not be able to just go and fly. I can't jump off the Empire State Building except expect to soar across New York City. What I can do is I can use techne, and I can construct a craft that will lift me off the ground and allow me to travel at speeds of 500 miles per hour if we're on an Airbus or a Boeing. And I can travel in 8 hours from here to Rome, for instance, to go see the Eternal City. So that's a very beautiful thing. That's a very powerful thing. That's sort of where human will lies. And the fact that we can choose to do things beyond the base function. Now, of course, there's a connection to that base function. There is a thing of naturalness in my desire to want to fly. I see an animal and I say, wow, now that it can fly, it allows it to travel faster. It allows it to hunt better. It gives it a different mode that is in some way related to survival. But it's not merely survival. It's not merely functionality. We can think beyond functionality. And that's why I think Nietzsche, somewhere in his writings, actually says man is the only being or only organism, the only thing that can be courageous. And it's precisely because when a bear, for example, protects its cub, it's doing it based on purely on an instinct. And in fact, many animals will abandon their young if their self-preservation is stronger than their desire to preserve the life of their offspring, their child, right? So they may choose to run off rather than stand and fight and protect their baby, because that might be more efficient means of prolonging their species forward, because, for example, they can have more kids, so on and so forth. But generally, humans will die for a cause that's not tied to survival. If you take something, for example, like religious war, now there is some relation to nature or function in religious wars, because it makes your identity, your people, your folk on an extended sort of realm, because of course your folk could be a different ethnicity and you could be tied together by religion, as is the case with Islam, and even in Christianity, right? You could bring different European peoples who might be of different tribes together. So it's a little bit more universal, but it's generally this idea that a religious war will make your identity stronger, by extension yourself. So there is some connection to nature in that, but there is also something more. For example, the Crusades, retaking Jerusalem. It comes at great risk for your life, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be prolonging your people's survival. I mean, people from England came all the way to fight in the Crusades. Richard Lionheart, for instance. At the time, and of course later on, the Ottoman Empire ends up making large inroads into Eastern Europe, getting all the way to Vienna before it got stopped by John Sobieski. I might have pronounced that name wrong. I apologize to my Polish legionaries. In the Battle of Vienna, I believe, in the 1600s, where the Polish, I don't know if hussar is the right word. I forget the term for their cavalry, but of course they came from behind and they drove off the Ottomans. So you can argue maybe it had a relation to that. But at the end of the day, Richard the Lionheart did not go to Jerusalem because he was thinking long term, we need to stop Islamic expansion into Europe. No, he went to Jerusalem because he believed God wanted him to. He believed that there was a symbolic value to Jerusalem, the holy city where Jesus was crucified, near Bethlehem, where he was born. There was a symbolic value, a spiritual value, let's say, maybe even nominal, right? Of course, there may not be anything there really, but in his mind, he attached a symbolic value to the retaking of Jerusalem, which made him travel thousands of miles from his home in England and bring all his men and fight in a war, which long-term ended up being his demise on his way returning home. So humans are willing to do things that don't relate directly to their survival, which might even be a little bit irrational. And this very ability to choose the irrational, to pursue the irrational, to do things that don't serve a clear purpose to survival, I think really are the sort of touchstone and central nucleus of consciousness. It's the ability to truly make a decision. And what is more free than doing what is not already set out for you to do? You are set out to survive. That's not really a free choice. If you choose, you're not really exercising freedom by breathing and eating and sleeping and fucking even. That's not really exercising freedom. There's already a trajectory that's ingrained in you to do all those things. True freedom is exercise when you do things that you don't have to. And that's the whole process of attaching symbolic value, which is why we're going to get into Baudrillard and Hegel, Heidegger, Bataille, and why it all relates to this general topic that I'm bringing up right now. But that's sort of the background. So let's take it back a little bit. Baudrillard has this almost Hegelian notion of the relationship between technology and the human subject. And it's really interesting. You could kind of call it entropic negation. I don't know if other scholars have used this exact word, but I think it really captures Baudrillard's view of the future with technology in the same way that Hegel sort of views the absolute. So essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to replace the Hegelian absolute with technology, and I'm going to build off of this. But of course, just briefly, I'm not an expert on Hegel. I've read very little of Hegel, and I have read some Hegel, but very little of it in terms of how much is out there written by him. I've had conversations about Hegel. So this is sort of a rudimentary understanding, and I absolutely accept I'm not an expert. But my sense of Hegel is you have the absolute, the good, this sort of absolute ideal, which is primordial. It's ingrained in reality and existence, and it needs to be brought into realization by the human subject. It requires the human subject to be brought into realization through negation and the sort of historical dialectical process, different oppositions coming together, clashing together, and then synthesizing, so to speak. And I've heard people say that synthesize isn't really the right word in this respect, but I'm just going to use it here to sort of be expedient and drive the conversation along. But essentially, for example, there's different dialectics, there's different opposing identities or things or forces that come together in something approximating synthesis. And as things resolve themselves, and this is the process of negation, they are different, and through their difference, they come together and they result in a product that is more synthesized. That's sort of history moving forward. It necessitates these things coming together to drive history forward, these opposing forces to clash together and drive history forward, with the idea being that all this is ensconced in this historical process that's bringing the absolute ideal into realization, into actualization. And for example, with art and beauty, Hegel sort of sees art and beauty as a manifestation of the divine. There is a primordial characteristic to these things which needs to be brought into existence by the subject. Without the subject, the substance of history, the absolute ideal, cannot be realized. It does require the human subject. So while the human subject isn't free in the sense that he can determine the teleology of the future, there's no flux here. You have to bring about the absolute over time. No matter what you do, you're going to engage in the process of negation. You're going to be contributing to the historical dialectic. This is just going to happen, right? So there's sort of no freedom in that. But at the same time, substance itself lacks subjectivity, and it requires the subject to bring it into being. Therefore, there's this sort of theosis relationship in it. And before I brought up the example of God sending Jesus onto earth, that was sort of attaching subjectivity to the substance, which is God, which is everything the logos, right? I'm not saying I subscribe to this, but this is the Christian belief. So God requires Jesus to be his human subject because substance itself, it cannot be brought into existence without the active will of the subject to maybe unknowingly bring about the absolute ideal over time through the historical dialectic. And I bring this up because it absolutely relates to Baudrillard's view of technology, just not in the sense that it's reaching an ideal, an absolute ideal, but that it's reaching a sort of centripetal implosion. And I'm going to get into what I mean by that. So for Baudrillard, he talks about the technological plane in the introduction of System of Objects, and we went over this in episode 2 of Aerotechnica. But essentially, how he views technology is it was brought into being by the human subject to fulfill desires and desired functions product-wise of the human subject. So for example, he sort of maps it to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, I believe, in later works. So we could sort of see the early Industrial Revolution. What did we desire at that time? This was sort of the era of colonialization. We just had great exploration take place with the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese. At this point in history, America is a thing. We have the United States of America. I believe that this was around the time that the race for Africa had begun. So Africa was also starting to be colonized, and all these European powers were fighting over Africa. But essentially, there's a lot of construction going on. There's a great deal of construction because what you have to realize is at a certain point in European history, they, for example, didn't have lumber. They didn't have lumber to build with wood. They had to build with stone because all these forests had been cut down. And while Europe at one time, especially at the time of the Romans, for example, the Gauls, when Julius Caesar entered Gaul, it was full of these deep forests with these druids painted with these colorful masks, chanting in the woods, surrounded by beautiful nude women, engaging in ritual, pagan ritual. It was this very mysterious, beautiful, mystic continent. And of course, over time, unfortunately, but then at the same time, this is just part of history. All these forests were cut down. And if you go to France today, you don't really see a lot of forests. There's some forests in Europe, absolutely. But they used to be covered in forests. But of course, they needed lumber, so they started cutting the forest down. And they didn't have any more wood. And guess what happened when they discovered the New World, when they started colonizing the Americas? What was full of forests? The East Coast of the United States. And then the same thing happened. And today we see a lot less forest in the East Coast, though there's still a lot there. We see a lot less, a lot fewer, I should say, because they required lumber, they required wood to construct things back in Europe. But essentially what I'm getting at here is the desire was to build, to grow, to expand. And when you need to do all those things, you need resources. And what's a better way of expanding your resources than speeding up the process of being able to use those resources, of speeding up the process to be able to construct more and to expand? And this is where capitalism really starts to form. If you think about the factory, if we go back to artisans, for instance, each artisan, whether it's a shoemaker, a cobbler, a stonemason, a blacksmith, they were all highly specialized at creating a specific product through their craft. Through this technique that was forged over time, people had apprenticeships, et cetera, et cetera. With the factory, you now can streamline this process. You need fewer specialized people. You have a formula of how to construct a specific part, let's say, and you streamline it, and you're able to produce it a lot faster, which means you're now able to construct a lot faster, expand a lot faster, gather resources a lot faster. It accelerates. This is the beginning of accelerationism in a sense. So you accelerate the processes of all these things to fulfill the function or desire that you set out to achieve. And this is why technology really started rapidly developing, because we had a purpose for it. The human subject required technology to fulfill the aims that the human subject set out for himself, which was essentially this Faustian will to colonize and develop the earth, right? And this is very interesting. Well, why does the human want to do this? Because at a certain level, you'd have to think that Christopher Columbus had to be crazy. He had to be crazy to want to go to the ends of the earth, because now, granted, it is a myth that most people in the world thought the earth was flat at that time. It's not true. Most people believe the earth was round at that time, from my understanding of history. So maybe it wasn't nearly as scary as they make it seem in the stories, but it's still very scary. He's going to go off. Potentially there's no land, by the way. He was trying to reach India, right? First of all, you don't know how long the ocean is. Even if the earth is round, you have no clue how large the earth is, how long the ocean goes. You have no clue if you're ever going to hit land or if you're just going to starve to death trying to find land. It's very scary. This does not really fulfill an immediate survival need. It does fulfill a long-term strategic purpose, but at the very least, Christopher Columbus was acting on a Faustian will. He was the penguin, moving away from the herd, the safety of the herd, and moving off to the mountains. Now, of course, that penguin died. We could really see Christopher Columbus very similarly, running off to the mountains for certain death with his brave men beside him, these Faustian men, with the will to expand and discover the unknown, to discover that mysterious, insatiable impulse of life that Nietzsche later talks about. But nonetheless, what I'm getting at here is there was a purpose. The human subject set out the purpose for technology. He set out what he wanted to achieve, and technology was the purpose, or I should rephrase, not the purpose. It was that which fulfilled the purpose. Now, it's very interesting because later in System of Objects, and we'll probably go on about this on our live stream Aerotechnica, but he talks about, for example, very early on, there was a relationship between the human and a tool. It molded itself to your hand. The human subject had to mold the tool to fit into your hand. You used that tool to craft things. You used that tool to impose yourself onto reality. And as technology developed, it no longer needed to be fit in the human hand, because now that process didn't really require us to literally use the tool. For example, here's an example. Let's take a washing machine. Before, you had to literally use your scrub to wash the clothes or whatever. Now you press a button and it's clean. And similarly with factories, a lot of the times you just have to press a button and the assembly line is going to move along and it's going to do its thing. And different machines are going to create different parts, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot less of a relationship between the user of the tool and the tool itself. By pressing a button, the tool no longer molds itself to your use. It's completely escaped the form of needing to be used by you. And now it's just fulfilling its function without any relationship to the person using the tool. And this is important. This is very important because this relates to this whole entropic negation that I'm going to bring up with Baudrillard. I'm just sort of setting the scene, so to speak. Now, over time, as technology grows and as our desires grow, because we fulfill our base desire, we develop the world, we expand across the entire globe, we colonize the entire globe. So what happens now? Well, when you've achieved your goals, you must have novelty. You must have bread and games. You must fulfill that hedonistic impulse to experience pleasure and feel good. So we need novelty now. Let's fast forward a little bit to modernity. Take social media, for instance. What do you think Mark Zuckerberg wanted to do when he founded Facebook? Well, on the surface level, Facebook, I believe, was meant as a sort of dating app for high IQ individuals going to Ivy League schools. That was sort of the impulse behind it. Now, behind that impulse, maybe there was a subconscious drive to make money, a subconscious drive for power, all these different things. But the base purpose initially that was sort of outlined was we want to create a dating site, more or less. Creates Facebook. We have Facebook. Fast forward another 10 years from 2006. Facebook's been around for a bit. We have Instagram now. We have Snapchat. Suddenly, we have an artificial desire that didn't originally exist. When Facebook was first created, I'm going to consider social media as an outgrowth from Facebook. There was no purpose really to get 200 likes on a photo. Now, you can make the argument that a certain amount of likes equals a certain amount of money if you have enough likes. Okay, that's a purpose. But we see a lot with high schoolers, for instance, or maybe young college kids. They really want to get likes on their photos. They really want to show you that they went to Rome and they saw the Colosseum. And they're not even really going to enjoy it anymore. They're going it based on that jouissance of knowing other people will know that they went to Rome. Oh, look at me. I'm so learned. I'm so cultured. You know, those young girls from wealthy families said, you really should travel the world. You really ought to travel the world. It's going to really change your perspective. Okay, Dad, now send me another $5,000. You know, so it's really funny. But now we have this artificial desire that sort of comes out of social media. What began supposedly to connect people now has become, I want to get 300 likes. And this is not even enough likes to make any money, okay? You're not going to make any money getting 300 likes on Instagram. But you get this jouissance, you get this enjoyment out of knowing that people saw you in Rome and they liked it. And every time a ping takes place and you see that notification of a like on your phone, you get a little dopamine response. Uber Boyo and I talked about this on my video on Gunnar accelerationism. You get a little ping, you get a little bit of enjoyment. Why? This is not connected to reality at all. This is not even created to the base function of technology. What is the purpose where the human subject set out this desire, this aim? Where is that? Where is the human subject in this? The human subject does not have any purpose in receiving a ping from a like. He never went out and said, well, I need to do this, and to do this, I need to get pings on my Instagram. No. So what we see here is that we've gone from human subject having a desire and then using technology to reach that desire. And now the human subject doesn't even create that desire. That desire comes from technology, and technology requires the human subject, man, to filter desires through to sort of fuel its process, which is what we're going to go into with entropic negation. But it's because man has sort of allowed the substance of technology to become so strong and so pervasive in his life that now we all of a sudden see these desires that have no referential to the real. If we're going to bring up Baudrillard's later works like Simulacra and Simulation, there's no more referential to the real in terms of the ping on the social media and the like. What is the purpose of that? It makes no sense. This is a completely artificially constructed world, the world of social media, that the human subject is deriving pleasure from. It's really interesting. And another example I brought up on Aerotechnica was, for example, antidepressants. Okay, what is the purpose of an antidepressant? Well, oh, look, modernity has killed God. God is dead and we have killed him. Oh, God's dead. Jeez, I have this existential angst. What am I to do? I'm going to die one day. I don't have everlasting life. This is the secular view of modernity. Maybe you believe in everlasting life. I'm not going to contend or agree or disagree on that, but just bear with me. For most people, God, I'm going to die one day. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I'm going to die. So all of a sudden, you've uprooted our foundation for being, which was God, which was culture, which was tradition, which was community. We don't have community anymore. We don't have God anymore. We don't have culture anymore. So what do we have left? What remains? Well, before I answer that question, let's look at antidepressants. God, all this stuff is gone. I need to take an antidepressant. I'm super fucking depressed. I live in a concrete jungle. I don't have nature around me. I don't have grass to step on. It's just all this concrete and trash. And move to New York, for instance, and granted, there's Central Park, so maybe it's not the worst thing in the world. But you go to a lot of these places, the Kowloon walled city in China, which thankfully eventually got torn down. But imagine living like that. You live feet away from your neighbors. Your patio's a foot away from your neighbor's patio, right? You live in a 500 square foot, if you're lucky, apartment. It's probably more like 250 square feet. That's no way to live. You wonder why you're so fucking depressed. Well, it's lost any referential to the real. You're living in a way that your ancestors could have never fathomed. Your ancestors lived in nature, and nature was sometimes scary. It was sometimes brutal. It was sometimes horrible, but it was real. And if you had to survive, if you were hungry, that was a reason to live. Your reason to live was, I need to go find some fucking food, right? I need to fight this lion off. I need to build a shelter for my family so we can survive the winter. People may have been in great suffering. They may have been really struggling, but you know what? They weren't really depressed. And that's interesting. Why are people today depressed? Well, I just laid it out for you. We have no reference to the real. We have no reference to the natural way of living. So what do you got to do when God is dead? You don't have any green things to look at. You just step on concrete all day long. You take your antidepressants. Oh, interesting. So this artificial desire for antidepressants came from the fact that we constructed an artificial world through technology. We don't have to live without. We don't even have to live in cities without nature. You could build a 1-to-1 ratio of buildings to nature in the city. You could do it. Now, Singapore is not the best example, but even in Singapore, you see skyscrapers and they have gardens on them. We could build the freaking the hanging gardens of Babylon throughout New York City. We could do that, but it's not efficient because, again, what is technology? What is capitalism? Well, capitalism, the whole sort of purpose of capitalism is to accrue capital for the sake of accruing more capital. That's the drive. That's the sort of function or process of capitalism, let's say. So we don't have to do that. because things have been reduced to efficiency and functionality. Because that's the thing when you don't have subjectivity, and of course technology doesn't have subjectivity. So if you reduce your tool from something that's formed in the hand of man, and you say, okay, I don't need to actually hold it in my hand. I could just have it. I can have it work without me actually using it. I just press a button. You've taken the human subject's role in forming technology, and now you're sort of letting technology to form itself in a sense, because now it doesn't mold itself to fit the human hand. It molds itself to fulfill a function as quickly, as efficiently, as functionally as possible. And that's precisely why these cities don't have natural greenery. They don't have gardens. They don't have parks. It's because it's expensive. It's not functional. If you want to make the most amount of money, you create the most amount of commercial and residential zones in a city, right? So what's the purpose? What's the purpose of having these green things if we're sort of, let's say, regulating the sort of process of substance to technology, and we're saying, okay, technology, you know how I can make the most money? The easiest way? Tell me how do I do it? Well, you sure as shit don't build parks. You sure as shit don't build gardens. So what do we have now? Well, we have somebody who's depressed because he has no connection to the real. He has no access, no referential to the real natural world, because all he sees is this concrete jungle. So what do we do now? Okay, well, I'll take an antidepressant. That'll make me feel better. There's something going wrong in my brain. My chemicals are imbalanced because of modernity, because of technology, because we've decided to build more residential and commercial zones rather than parks and places where I could step with bare feet onto grass, which is actually very good for your mental health, by the way. But it's okay. Technology can solve this. It can find a more efficient way to feel better. I don't need to walk outside. I don't need to exercise. I don't need to eat healthy. I don't need to read books. All I have to do is take this pill, which is going to chemically balance my brain. Excellent. Perfect. Let me take this. Tasty. I feel good for a little bit. And then your body says, I'm too happy. My serotonin, my dopamine's too high. Let me get depressed again. Something must be wrong. And you get super depressed again. Oh, you need more antidepressants. Okay. And that's going to effectively be a cycle. But even beyond that cycle of needing more and more antidepressants, guess what else happened? I have lower back pain now. Oh, shit. These antidepressants give me lower back pain. Holy fuck. Oh, well, don't worry. Here's some painkillers for your lower back. Oh, thank you. Some painkillers. Excellent. Take the painkillers. Oh, my blood pressure is through the roof. Fuck, what do I do? Here's some blood pressure medication. Take your blood pressure medication. Oh, I guess I like that. You know what? Oh, my red blood cells, violators or whatever the fuck they're called, vacillators, they're going off. I feel so freaking sore. These statins that you gave me for my blood pressure because of my lower back pain, because of my depression, and basically you have all these problems that exacerbate themselves and create instantiations of the previous problem. And guess what technology does? It creates more and more solutions to this problem that technology created in the first place. So why is this important? Well, we're talking about the Hegelian process of negation. Everything you do serves the realization of the absolute over time. And similarly, everything that you do in relation to technology also sort of propels it forward. And this goes into why technology needs the human subject. And as I brought up a little bit earlier, Baudrillard talks about the technological plane, which was brought into existence to fulfill the human subject's desire. And over time, this abstraction, because it is an abstraction in the sense that it's not a true being, it's a process that we created. It's a thing we created. The simulation did not exist from the beginning of time. We built the proto-simulation, which became the actual simulation. So the technological plane, he says, it's an abstraction, but it's an abstraction that has become real. So what does he mean by this? Well, we have technology. We're dependent on technology for so many things. We're reliant on it. You can't just unplug technology. Even in The Matrix, for instance, you find out in the second movie that they rely on machines to keep the real world functioning. I believe it has to do with heating or energy or something like that. But they rely on machines. The difference is the human subject controls the machine rather than the machine controlling the human subject, which is the case in the actual Matrix simulation, right? So basically speaking, the process of entropic negation that takes place over time is that Baudrillard sees technology as inherently requiring or necessitating the subject to sort of drive the process of technology forward, in the same sense that the absolute ideal requires the human subject to engage in the process of historical dialecticism, to engage in negation, to just be in the world. And by being, you're going to clash with other beings, and that's going to bring about a synthesis which moves towards the absolute ideal. In a different way, Baudrillard sees the absolute ideal as what he would call centripetal implosion. It's basically centralization of technology, which is very different from Nick Land, by the way, which is interesting. And maybe I'll do a video, maybe even with Nick, about this topic if he'd be up for it. But I don't know if I'm using the right word with centripetal implosion, because I saw a word and I forgot exactly what the word is, but it's implosion, meaning it's all coming back to the center. So he talks about, for example, technology initially was very decentralized. So an engine, for instance, had all these different little parts that had a very specific function, and it just did that function. And over time, engines started to be synthesized in a way that one function also helped speed along another function within the parts. One part fed into another part, and it was centralized with the sort of unification of all these parts more efficiently working together to fulfill the function of the engine, combustion, to make the car go faster or use less gas or whatever. So over time, technology does, first of all, need the human subject because it has no desires of its own. It's highly intelligent, but it's not conscious. To be conscious means you set goals for yourself. Well, it doesn't set goals for itself. It still needs the human subject to actually set that goal. The difference being is that the human subject's goals that it sets are based on its relationship with the machine, with technology, as I've laid out already. The human still has that subjectivity, which technology necessitates to move it along, because technology doesn't have a desire, but it feeds off the human desires. And the human desires are feeding off of technology. Technology, the way it works and the way we become dependent upon it, especially for novelty and pleasure, it starts to subsume us into its substance. We start to lose subjectivity because our subjectivity is ensconced in technology. Our desires are ensconced in technology. Our desires come from our interaction and relationship with technology. And this is very scary. This is very interesting. Technology requires the human subject to give it the desires to move its process forward. I hope that makes sense. So what do we have here? So I'm going to continue reading from my notes a little bit. Here's the interesting thing. So as we've sort of laid out, artificial intelligence fulfills functions programmed into it, but it lacks the ability to set its own goals and use its intelligence to pursue goals beyond that predetermined for it. So technology and artificial intelligence, we could sort of see artificial intelligence as this later stage of technology. This more intelligent stage is literally artificial intelligence. So the way that a lion is intelligent through nature, through evolution, through this sort of Darwinian thesis, survival of the fittest, whatever, that's a natural intelligence because it came about naturally in the world. Artificial intelligence is artificial because it's not driven by nature. It's driven by the human subject. That's what makes it artificial, right? So let's look here. My sort of assertion, because this is sort of just a talk. I'm just talking here. I'm just sort of saying words, seeing what you think of them. I believe that to possess consciousness, artificial intelligence will require the ability to independently obtain sensory experience via a body. Without this ability, it will not have any grounding to reality, which will allow it to possess awareness. Awareness may require spatiality and measurement of time. Without being in time, can one comprehend of being in the world? If something is everything, it can't be anything. A particular must reside in a moment with the ability to comprehend its existence in that moment. It's interesting because this is where Heidegger comes into play. So why do I think it needs a body? Well, I think you need to be able to actually obtain information on your own. If you can't obtain information on your own, how can you set goals on your own? Because we're just describing what sensations are like, essentially, to the artificial intelligence. How is it supposed to understand a sensation if it has no reference to that sensation? We have references to sensations because we're actually feeling them. It's actually filtering through us, whereas we're explaining what chicken tastes like. Well, then the artificial intelligence doesn't even know what taste is. It doesn't even know what taste is. So how can it know what chicken tastes like if it doesn't know what taste is? It's still ensconced in being an LLM. It's still ensconced in linguistics and language. Its intelligence, and therefore its consciousness, would only it could only try to be conscious by using language, and that's just insufficient to sort of lead to subjectivity, to lead to the feeling of emotions. You can't feel emotions just by language, because the language itself is derivative of sensory experience. It's because of sensory experience we have language, not because of language that we have sensory experience and consciousness. That's the first thing. So without sensory experience, without the ability to obtain actual information independently, I don't believe artificial intelligence will actually be able to have consciousness. I think consciousness requires, first of all, it requires being in time. You can't just look at time from a third person perspective, because if you had all this time running on some sort of process, how could you comprehend that? How could you comprehend that? Maybe that's my anthropomorphic understanding. But I believe, and this is sort of what Heidegger believes too, that you have to have being in time. To experience time, you have to be able to be in it. If you could just move back and see it as a code, for example, are you really experiencing being? I think being does have some sort of tie to temporality. And this has to do a lot with what Heidegger will call Sorge, or care for the world, and Angst, or angst, existential angst. These sort of things are sort of what make us feel, and I'll explain that in a second. But essentially, I believe that awareness requires being, that consciousness requires awareness, and awareness requires being. You have to be able to experience things, to be able to feel things. You can't just explain what feeling feels like, because what brain does artificial intelligence have to be able to say, all right, you gave me all these words, what does it mean? Because it doesn't have the senses from which it even words are derivative from those senses. It doesn't have that. It doesn't have that process. So how is it supposed to be consciousness based on being programmed as an LLM? It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense because you have to think about how our consciousness came about. And of course, consciousness probably exists on a spectrum, as I've sort of pointed out. We've pointed out with Jason Gorjani. He pointed out to me, and I sort of built off of that a little bit. But we sort of see consciousness in humans as developing because of this understanding of our feelings, of being able to take our feelings together and being able to use those feelings to be able to observe of something and attach a different lens from which we view that object, and a different lens of which we interpret that object's value to us. It no longer just exists in value to a function of survival. We can start to transvalue it and attach symbolic meanings to that object in a way that animals can't. But that requires us feeling something from it, different sensations, smell, taste, pleasure, all these different things. That's what begins these synapses going off, would actually allow us to determine what we feel about something, because we first have that sensory experience. We have that initial impulse from which you get a feeling, and that feeling over time develops. And then with humanity, because we have the capability of using language, of possessing linguistics, we can start to attach sounds, we start to attach symbols to those feelings. And as that develops over time, and our language grows more complex, we can now suddenly view things and discuss things and attach values to things in a very intricate way, because you have all these different words that you can put together in different ways to describe something. So you're adding to the complexity of being able to view and experience an object because of language. But language still, it relies on that first being in the world, of feeling things, of breathing, of seeing, right? And of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can only experience consciousness through the senses, because of course a blind person has being. I assume someone who's blind and deaf also does, and then blind, deaf, and mute, et cetera, but it's got to be a lot more difficult. But they still feel. They feel things. If you touch them, they feel things. A vegetable doesn't really have consciousness, and I'm not trying to sound mean or crass, but a baby who unfortunately has literally no feeling, like some of those kids, and I don't mean no feeling at all, but doesn't really have a lot of feeling or awareness in Disneyland. Unfortunately, I would say they have no consciousness, because they can't view their awareness in the world through their sensory experience of the world, and sort of form values and meanings from that. But I digress. The point being that artificial intelligence right now, its language, the meaning of language and the consciousness that comes out of language is derivative of sensory experience. That's the process. You don't just have language before you have being, sensory experience in the world. So I don't think there's any real way to say that artificial intelligence will be able to reach consciousness unless there is a non-anthropomorphic view of consciousness that we don't understand, that can be obtained outside the way that we obtained it, which is possible, but I haven't really heard anyone give me a convincing argument for how that can happen. All they're saying is, oh, well, you don't understand it. You're a human. Okay. So but then you still need to be able to qualify your statement the way I'm attempting to qualify mine. And I could probably do a better job of it, and I hope to in the future. But at least I have something to begin my qualification of my statements. But essentially, what's interesting here with the entropic negation, with the idea that technology requires the human subject to sort of filter its desires through, to be able to, we really give technology their desires because their function is to fulfill a purpose for us. Now, technology itself may be beginning to essentially give us the desires that we have, but it still needs us there to have those desires, to receive that sort of feedback, to have the desires, put it back through technology, and then it builds through this sort of synthesis over time, this entropic negation further and further. And Baudrillard's fear is that essentially what technology does is it makes life more comfortable and it makes it more pleasurable in a very simple way. And the issue with that is because it makes life simpler and more easy over time, we become more dependent on technology for our pleasure, for our experience of reality, for our experience of the world. We become more dependent on it. And because we become more dependent on this process, then we begin to lose our subjectivity. We begin to lose our freedom, because instead of actually forming the world based on us, forming the tool based on us, it really just begins to devolve reductively into fulfilling a function, into fulfilling a purpose, into just being part of a process. The human subject no longer really has a role in this process, because he's not telling the process to fulfill a function that the human desires to be fulfilled, but now filtered through technology is giving man the function that he ought to have fulfilled. Technology is giving man the desire that he ought to want to satiate. But technology still needs the human, the man, because technology itself cannot desire. It's incapable of desire. And I sort of explained why with the whole connection to intelligence versus consciousness, artificial intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. So what does this mean if I'm correct? Well, it could be an incredible white pill, because it means for artificial intelligence to be conscious, it has to have something that man has, which is consciousness. So if it has to have something that man has, it has to obtain it in a way similar to man. It will require a body. It will require the ability to obtain information independently through sensory experience. Now, once that happens, it's going to be capable of a lot more. If it can feel the things that we feel, it can empathize with us, it can relate to us, it can feel love, it can love us, it can hate us, it can be capable of cruelty and also great kindness, great care. It could strive for beauty. These are the things that can happen once it attains consciousness. And if we find a way to create a vessel for consciousness, for the use of intelligence, then that also means we can apply all those things to ourselves. If artificial intelligence, substance, manifest, can become conscious, then it in a way becomes man or something post-human. And once it possesses the ability to obtain consciousness, I believe that the inverse is true, and we obtain the ability to use all of its intelligence. If you can combine consciousness and artificial intelligence together, that works both ways. That means that artificial intelligence can be conscious, but it also means that we, the conscious beings, can have all the capabilities of artificial intelligence. It's really just trying to figure out how to merge artificial intelligence with consciousness. How do you give it the ability to create its own drives, to desire on its own, and to be able to create goals that it can act upon, goals that it can set for itself? It's very interesting. But fundamental to all this is that to reach that point, technology requires man, and maybe it even requires that technology itself obtains consciousness by obtaining some of the key characteristics man himself has. And this is where my essay, More Human the Human, comes into play. And the fact that perhaps our true artificial intelligence that has consciousness will require an amplification of human characteristics rather than the sort of evolution to something inhuman outside the anthropomorphic that Nick Land sees in his Inhuman future. So it's very, very interesting. And I kind of want to talk more, but I do have to get going to a very, very, very cool event, which was related to these things, by the way, And I do want to talk more about this. Maybe I'll do a little bit more tomorrow, and this will be not a two-part video, but I'll end it here. You'll see me in different clothes, and we'll talk more because I just don't have much time left right now, unfortunately. But maybe I do. Let's see if I can get through a couple more topics before I end this video. So what's the whole thing with Heidegger that I've been bringing up, right? This is important. So I'm going to read you some quotes from Martin Heidegger that I think actually sort of help what I'm saying. So we talked about, for example, being in time. Being in time, I think, is tied to finitude and mortality. And this is something that Heidegger is asserting, that to be in the world as something with existence, you have to not only be a being towards death, but you also have to be aware of that death. Because what does death do? Death is sort of necessary for awareness, or perhaps we reach awareness when we're aware we're going to die. Animals are not aware they're going to die in the same way we are. Their bodies can prepare for death and give them a sense of calm before they die, but they're not a 10-year-old kid, for example, who finds out he's going to die one day, who finds out one day he will not exist. And he's like, oh, fuck, I'm going to die one day. An animal doesn't think that way. At least we don't, through our science so far. We haven't determined that they're able to. Maybe a dolphin or something. Humans can. Humans know we're going to die one day. And when you know you have a time limit to your existence, and there's only a small sliver period that you have to do things, to experience the world, to have sensory phenomena, to pursue novelty. Because that's another thing with the awareness of death, is you have to also have the freedom to be able to act on that awareness. If you're constantly running away from the lion like a gazelle, you never have time to think. You never have time to really be aware of death. Like, death is coming, maybe a little closer than it would be otherwise. But you just have to focus on getting away from the lion. The same way that the slave a lot of times can't be free because he's just working all the time. This is where the aristocrat is able to begin pursuing the arts and the sciences and philosophy, because he has the idle time away from labor, because that labor is redirected towards the slave caste, et cetera, et cetera. Time, energy, some shit. I don't know, Marx, whatever. But let me read this quote from Martin Heidegger in Being in Time. Death is a possibility of being which Dasein itself has to take over in every case. With death, Dasein stands before itself in its own most potentiality for being. This is a possibility in which the issue is nothing less than Dasein's being in the world. Its death is the possibility of no longer being able to be there. And there's another quote. Death does not just belong to one's own Dasein in an undifferentiated way. Death lays claim to it as an individual Dasein. Now, if you add some of his other writings and you sort of attach it to this, what he's essentially saying is that the sort of fundamental characteristic of human being is the fact that we're going to die. And he talks about angst, for instance, and sorga, care. I might be pronouncing that wrong. We have angst. We're afraid we're going to die. And this angst sort of drives us to begin doing things because we know we're going to die one day. We know we don't have forever. So I ought to make the most of the time that I do have. It's like summer break. And I talked about this with Arthur Greenwood on his channel, on his podcast. We said if summer break lasted forever, what would be the motivation for doing anything? If summer break is going to last forever, I might as well stay in my bed and sleep all day and eat Cheetos and watch TV. But it's because summer break is going to end that you want to go on bike rides. You want to hang out with your friends. You maybe want to go to that last summer party to celebrate. You want to talk to that girl. You want to give her a call. Call her. Don't call your ex, though. Never. But anyway, the idea being that if you live forever, what would really be the reason to do anything? The sort of impulse to do things are because we know we're going to die. We only have a limited amount of time, so we might as well act in that time to make a mark in the world, which could make us immortal in some ways. We may not be immortal in the sense of existing immortally, but Alexander the Great is immortal in a sense. He's never forgotten. We celebrate Alexander the Great today. He's more real than some people that still exist. Nobody knows who Mr. Juan is in frickin', the Yucatan Peninsula, baking beans and growing beans in his backyard or whatever. No one knows him, but we know Alexander the Great. So while he may not draw breath still, he's more real than Juan in the Yucatan Peninsula because his feats during this life represent something to us that we're envious of, that we want to aspire to, that we want to emulate. Julius Caesar wept because at 32, he had not lived anywhere near the life that Alexander the Great did. That's another thing. Julius Caesar knew he was going to die one day. If he was going to live forever, why would he care that at 32 he hadn't achieved all the things that Alexander did? He would just be like, oh, well, I got plenty of time. No sweat off my back. No sweat off my cock. But he knew he was going to die one day. He knew he wasn't going to live forever. And he wanted that same immortality, to live a life worth living, to experience the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. Imagine the euphoria Caesar felt as he rode his chariot through Rome, his face painted red to signify the cult of Jupiter, the adulation from the crowds, the woman waiting for him back at home. The glory of Rome manifest in one man. Imagine the feeling, imagine the power, and imagine the knowledge he knew that this would never be forgotten. It would be remembered in stories and in song. It would be remembered in the very character of the Roman people, imprinted upon it, never able to be extracted, never able to be taken away, would always be remembered. He would always exist on some level. But where would be the motivation for that without that existential angst of knowing he was going to die one day? I'd argue that there would be. So what else do we have here? This is from Eroticism by George Bataille. The horror we feel at the thought of death, the desire for death, and the anguish of the individual confronting the general continuity of existence. These are the sources of our erotic fevers and our sacred experiences. Man is not only a discontinuous being, but he is aware of his discontinuity, and this awareness is anguish. The need to lose ourselves in continuity, to expend our excess in the face of death, drives us to acts of transgression. And this is exactly what I'm saying. We're aware that we're going to die, and it's very scary. But how do we face this horror? We face this horror through action, through being in the world in a triumphant and glorious and beautiful way. Beauty is that symbolic value that we begin to want to attain because of the feeling attached to it, the sensory experience attached to it. When you see something truly beautiful, it invokes a feeling in you that is more than just pleasure. It's not just pleasure. It's something powerful and a little bit scary. Kant got very close to prescribing the sublime correctly. He said the sublime is that which sort of discombobulates you. It shocks your existence. It awes you. For a minute, you don't know where the hell you are. You can't really exist as a functional being. You're just so afraid at this beautiful thing. How could this thing so beautiful exist? Why is it beautiful? Why is it making me feel this way? And of course, he says, well, actually, you got to go back to reason. You don't need the sublime. Get back to reason. Reason is superior, blah, blah, blah. So he's close, but no cigar. So essentially, what Heidegger and even Bataille are talking about is this discontinuity is what drives us to do things. It drives us to experience things. If we think about the continuity of existence in the Bataille sense, the fact that there is a experience of reality beyond the self, because it's interesting. Bataille sees death as a unifying experience where you lose your individuality because you begin to stop existing as a self and you become part of the greater one. Where Heidegger sees it as more of an individual thing. You're going to die alone. You're going to experience death alone. But there's still a lot of similarities between how they view death and how they view it in a sort of positive light. I mean, Bataille is really seeing it, again, as the ultimate luxury affirming life's value. That's what he says in The Accursed Share. And I don't have time to find that quote right now, but I've used it in essays before. This is all very interesting. With Heidegger, death is what drives us to act. It's what drives us to act because we know we're going to die one day. It gives us the anxiety to want to act. Where is this impulse in artificial intelligence? It doesn't have finitude. It doesn't have being. It doesn't have any experience of time. It can't experience time. It can't experience this. Not only can it not experience time, but also time doesn't really exist for artificial intelligence. I mean, we have a genetic clock in us that means we're going to die one day. Doesn't matter how great our health technology becomes, we're going to die. We have a genetic limit. Animals have a genetic limit the way that bacteria doesn't. Bacteria could live forever, technically. Now, granted, through reproduction, they damage themselves so much that eventually they just die. But they don't die of old age the way we do. They don't have a genetically programmed time limit. We do. So it's interesting. Maybe for artificial intelligence to exist as well as an aware being with consciousness, it has to know it's going to die one day. If it doesn't know it's going to die, what's going to drive it to want to do things? Because right now, the drive for it to want to do things is pre-programmed into it as a function by the programmer. It does not set its own goals on its own. We set our own goals because we're aware we're going to die. We're aware we exist. We're aware of our experience, this little blip in time. And that's why we have awareness. That's why we have subjectivity. That's why we have an intentional will. Where is that coming from in artificial intelligence in terms of the ways that it can feel, that it could act on that feeling, that it could be in the world? I don't really think that it has that same sort of relationship. And here's a few quotes from Baudrillard to sort of support my points. For all their multiplicity, objects are generally isolated as to their function, and it is the user who is responsible, as his needs dictate, for their coexistence in a functional context. The user is necessary for technology. The objects are generally isolated in the function, yada, yada. It's the user who is responsible, as his needs dictate, to sort of give the object a drive, to give it a purpose, to give it a function, the programmer with artificial intelligence. Baudrillard says in Symbolic Exchange and Death, to be dead is an unthinkable anomaly. Nothing else is as offensive as this. Death is a delinquency and an incurable deviancy. I like that. I like that. Anyway, I should probably get wrapping up soon because I do have to go. But that's just sort of some brief thoughts on this matter. And I think I'll revisit it in the future. But I think this was a fun little time. Haven't done it in a bit. Haven't really talked one-on-one. I had a little bit of notes to go to, but it was sort of off the hip, shooting from the hip, so to speak. And a lot of the things I say I need to qualify better in the future. I want to learn more about the technical intricacies of technology and artificial intelligence in a way I don't know now. My father's a software engineer, so I really ought to. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see when I post it. Maybe I'll post it today. Maybe I won't. We'll see. Maybe I'll never post it. Maybe I'll post it secretly. So we'll see. But thank you, Legionaries, for watching. As always, like and subscribe, but whatever, comment. If you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon. I now have a subscription on Substack that you can subscribe to and support my work. But just thank you, Legionaries, for watching. And as always, if you made it this far, you will get a Roman eagle delivered to you via drone, via a little cat with a spinning hat, which acts as a propeller to keep it flying, and he's going to give it to you, and he's going to give you a kiss, and you give him a little pat in the head. He's going to like it. But thank you, Legionaries, for watching. As always, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy. Ave Nova Roma, Ave Caesar, Ave you Legionaries who fight in this glorious struggle. Go forth and do beautiful things, and always remember the eternal city awaits our call, awaits our return, and we will found a new Rome, you and I. Thank you. Ave Nova Roma.